Hi everyone, I'm Claire. I'm currently a second year PhD student working primarily with Jay Van Bavel in the Social Identity and Morality Lab. And I wanted to, before I get started talking about my research, also give a little shout out to both my lab family and my cohort family. So that's me. This is my lab as we started kind of in our new COVID system, how we went through the process of switching to Zoom and all of those things. Everyone's been wonderful, super supportive. And this is my second year cohort. That's me also. Maybe I should have introduced other people instead of just me. But everyone at NYU is like super supportive, and it's been a really great experience, even given all of the challenges that we've been experiencing. And before I jump directly into my research, I want to tell you a little bit about what the Social Identity and Morality Lab does in general. So some of our main interests are, we look at things like fake news belief, when that gets really extreme, looking at things like conspiracy theory belief. We're really interested in intergroup relations, specifically things like political identity, partisanship, and then the offshoot of that being political polarization. We're also very interested in, as the name suggests, morality and how moral beliefs, moral convictions, moral updating influences all of the other kind of aspects that we've talked about. And in terms of what we use and how we do research, we have a lot of different ways that we conduct our studies. So we use social media data. I'm showing Twitter here, but we've used lots of different types of social media. We also do some neuroscientific methods. We've been using that a little less lately, I'll be honest, but it is something that our lab has used in the past. We also use survey methods, so more traditional big MTurk studies. We're really focused on high power, high sample size. And then also we've done some archival research, so things like meta-analyses, looking at publications, different types of, what type of science do scientific researchers' identities influence their replicability of their work and things like that. So really diverse range of methods for really complex questions. And to give you kind of a taste of what we do and what I'm working on right now, I want to ask you a question, which is, how do you choose your news? And this is actually a much harder question than we might think, because the news landscape has changed really rapidly and dramatically over the last few decades. So until relatively recently, there was very little choice in news. You had maybe your local papers and then 3 TV channels. However, with the advent of the internet, people have far more choice in what they attend to. And this in turn places the impetus on news sources to keep their readers' attention and get them coming back over and over. And this is really hard to do because most online news readers spend less than 5 minutes per month on any given website. So news sites are vying for the attention of the masses, and one way that they compete is by posting more and more outrageous and negative content, playing on the well-established negativity bias found across psychology and communication research. However, most studies on negativity bias in the news specifically are limited in a few important ways. First is that almost all of the studies to date have been conducted in a lab, which gives great experimental control, but doesn't always capture real-world behavior. Second, many of the larger web scraping studies lack experimental control, and specifically, they lack the ability to adjust for the topic of the headline. Lastly, some, although not all, of the laboratory studies that have been conducted have quite small sample sizes. So my colleagues and I set out to create the quote unquote best test of negativity bias in the news, one that is both applied and causal. And in order to do this, we're using a pretty cool data set from this new project called the Upworthy Research Archive, which is headed by Nate Mattis and is in partnership with Upworthy.com. Upworthy is a digital native news site that specializes in viral news stories, and you may actually remember it from being everywhere when we were in middle school. And unbeknownst to its readers, Upworthy achieved its virality by A/B testing all of their headlines, such that each story that they published had several corresponding headlines that a person might see. So each person who navigated to Upworthy.com saw a randomly selected sample of possible headlines. As an example, I've put on this slide 2 possible headlines for a story about Proposition 8, which prohibited gay marriage in California, being struck down by the Supreme Court. So these data are especially great for looking at the effect of negativity on news consumption, because they represent real world behavior that is also experimentally controlled. Different language and sentiment were used in headlines for the same story and were randomly presented to online news readers. So we use this data to examine how negativity influences engagement with the news. And don't worry about all of the technical details here, but specifically, we expected to see that the presence of negative words in a headline would lead to a greater chance that the headline would be clicked on, adjusting for the number of impressions that each headline received and the content of each story. And just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the whole model, but those are our basic IVs and DVs. So here I've plotted the fixed effects from our model, and it shows that we found that the presence of a negative word in a headline significantly increased the likelihood that a headline would be clicked on. The effect is somewhat small, such that the inclusion of each negative word led to a 3% increase in the likelihood that a headline was clicked on, but we're adjusting for the topic of the story here. So it's not just stories that are negative, it's the specific wording in a headline, even about the same story, that seems to be having this influence. We also see that number of impressions is a significant influencer of engagement, which makes sense. The more people who saw a story, the more likely it was to be clicked on. But we did not see an effect of positive words on engagement. So there does seem to be something very specific about negative sentiment here that's driving engagement, rather than simply any valenced emotion that is positive or negative. So we've run a few other models and analyses, but for the sake of time, I'm going to wrap up now. I just want to say thanks to my collaborators on this project, to Jay, my advisor, and Philip, who was a postdoc in our lab and is now back in Sweden. I also want to say thank you to the Social Identity and Morality Lab, the folks that are involved with the Upworthy Research Archive, and to you all for listening. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have now, or feel free to email me. I'm pretty much an open book. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. That was great. Any questions? Feel free to raise your hand or type them in the chat. Jacob, go ahead. And then Katie after that.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I was curious, the title of the lab has morality in it. So I was curious what type of moral research is done, and what exactly is meant by morality. Is that morality as such? Is it perceptions of morality? Is it moral judgment, reasoning? What exactly does morality look like in your lab?
That's a great question. So it encompasses a lot. So it is moral judgment. It includes moral reasoning. So the main thing that our lab is interested in is looking at how beliefs become moral beliefs. So why people become irrational about certain beliefs, or unwilling to compromise or make trade-offs on those beliefs. What we are not interested is arbitrating what is moral and what is not. That is nothing that we do. We're not really interested in a way, we're not interested in examining and litigating the content of moral beliefs. What we know is that people have these beliefs and they influence their perceptions, their behavior, their decision-making, and their impression of others. And those are the things that we're interested in. So regardless of if somebody believes, this, that, or the other, when that belief becomes moral, how is it influencing the way that they walk through the world, the way that they are able to create groups, break groups, and make decisions. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Great. Katie Mason's up next. And Mary, if you don't mind typing your question into the chat, we won't have time to get to that before our last presentation. Sorry to cut you off. Go for it, Katie.
Yeah, this is really cool research. I was just wondering if you found any, like in other analyses you did, like some moderating effects, like from ideology or gender, race, or maybe any other identities, and if there were like any interesting findings with that.
So that is a really good question. So what's interesting about the data that I presented here, and I'll try to explain this really succinctly so we can get to the last presentation. We actually had this aggregated at the level of the singular headline. So that headline about, we'll be embarrassed as hell that this law even existed. All we can see is that, 200 people clicked on it and 1,000 people saw it or something like that. We actually don't know who those people were, which is unfortunately a limitation of this data, these data rather. But there's lots of other things that we can look at. So that's where, the social media data comes in. It's less controlled. We don't have the A/B testing. We don't have the random selection feature, but we do have that individual level granularity that we can look at things at. So great question. Unfortunately, I don't know and I can't know in this data, but it's a really interesting question that I hope to look at in different data sets moving forward.
Thanks, Claire.